Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Catherine O'Brien, the host of Autism Goes to College. I'm a PhD student at UC Riverside and I'm autistic myself. This is the 40th episode of our podcast. And also, I've been hosting these conversations for 2 whole years now. This podcast grew out of the documentary film, which is streaming, and we'll have more details about that at the end of the show. It feels like this episode is the perfect way to wrap up this calendar year 2024. There's a brand new report out right now called the Neurodiverse Campus, which I love the title. Yes, campus should encompass brain diversity. And curiosity, it's 42 pages long, which tells you a lot, and that it is an important topic that this podcast is excited to cover. My guest on this episode is Amanda Morin, a neurodivergent neurodiversity consultant, author, and educator with a practice devoted to building accessible, empathetic learning spaces, and someone who was consulted in the creation of the report, The Neurodiverse Campus. Thanks so much for joining me, Amanda.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Yeah.
So first, I want to talk a little bit more about the report and about your contributions. And then we have so many more questions as well. So this new report, the Neurodiverse Campus, is published by the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Do you know how they decided to take on that issue or why they took it on right now?
Sure. Kelly Field, who is the reporter who did the entire report, which is extraordinary to think about. She does a lot of work for the Chronicle of Higher Education around disability and disability issues, and took a specific interest in neurodiversity and neurodivergence. And I actually use the terms differently, so I'm doing that very specifically. And so Kelly reached out to me because I had been a source for a number of different sort of either on background or talking to reporters before, knowing that I myself am neurodivergent. I self-ID as autistic, and I have neurodivergent children, some of whom have gone to college already, and also work with K through 12 students as well as their parents. And so thought I might have a really interesting lens on what it should look like to have a campus that is neurodiversity affirming, right? That includes all kinds of minds in the way that they look at it includes all kinds of minds in the way that they look at students. And when we first started speaking, I think that she was looking at what does it mean for professors, right? What does it mean for schools to really start thinking about what it is to include the entire population? And what my contribution ended up being was a really frank discussion about the importance of really making sure that all staff, and specifically professors and adjunct professors and teaching assistants, had the knowledge and right, because we're getting there, have the knowledge they need in order to support neurodivergent students in their classes and in their college experience. And I think the report just evolved from there. It's really an extraordinary piece of work that talks about sort of all of the different aspects of campus life.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting when you said professors and like pushing past that, I envisioned like getting into something that a lot of the research reports, which is residential life and social and dining, the aspects of campus that are really integral to the college experience, but often completely not talked about in accommodations. Did that end up being a piece of the report?
It is. I mean, it's part of the conversation that I had. It's part of the conversation some of the other people who she spoke with had as well. It was something that I was really passionate about saying. It's not just professors, it's all staff, it's all faculty, it's all the people who interact with students who really need to have an understanding of, the impact of being neurodivergent in a new and different kind of setting, right? You have been to college, you know what it's like. It's sort of like it's an artificial setting and also a very brand new one, right? It's a new one for a lot of students. And you never know who's going to be that one person on campus who really makes a difference in the life of a student. So I really think it's important that we're making sure everybody has an understanding of how to interact and how to support.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that working towards a place where that knowledge is provided and seen as mandatory is a really good step. but it will probably take time because I've certainly seen pushback on that in my own work.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's, education is not, and you know this well, Catherine, right?
Mhm.
Education moves sort of glacially and change comes with difficulty. And I think that it's a novelty at the moment to start talking about neurodiversity and neurodivergence on campuses. But I do think my utopian world would include in space where all staff, all faculty actually just had a baseline understanding, not even about like how to accommodate specific students, but a baseline understanding of what it means to have different kinds of minds represented in a classroom and what you can do in a classroom, what you can do in a syllabus, what you can do in a program to really retroactive, not retrofit, right? But proactively support all the students in your classroom without them having to come in and actually specifically say to you, this is the accommodation I need. But to be able to provide options. And, I would love to say that we're there, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, we're absolutely not there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, universal design for learning is better integrated in K-12 than it is in the university space. I have colleagues that are working on pushing out universal design style approaches to instruction. Universal design is just the idea of preparing in advance the way you teach to suit learners with a wide variety of brains, bodies, and life experiences. So that's something that we would love to see more of, but it's definitely not there yet.
It's-
Um, yeah.
yeah. And I think the universal design approach works really well in K through 12. I think it could work extraordinarily well on campuses, at university, colleges, community colleges, any of those kinds of programs, because it's looking at how do you engage and motivate students based on what like works for them? How do you ask them to show what they know in ways that are appropriate? And I just think, like, when we're thinking about preparing people for what comes next in their lives, that's the perfect time to say, "And how does this work for you? And how can you show us what you know? And how can we support you in being your most productive self?"
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you mentioned that ideally that could come through a setting that is evolved to support everyone and that the burden of asking for help and disclosing needs isn't on the individual. But at the same time, we're in a state currently where the question of disclosure is often kind of the crux of entering a new environment. So as an individual who's counseled a lot of neurodivergent kids and families and who has gone through this maybe with your own children, what are your thoughts about getting and sharing and disclosing a formal diagnosis?
Yeah, and I think those are like I would break them down, right? So the getting of the diagnosis is the first part. And
Mhm.
I think there are a lot of people, fear plays a lot into all of this, right? And I think there are a lot of people who, whether it's parents or students themselves, who are afraid to pursue that diagnosis because we think of diagnosis as label, which is not the same thing, right? A diagnosis is a way of providing more information about yourself, right? Learning more about how your brain works, learning more about who you are and what your needs are. I actually think diagnosis is a really important piece of this journey, and not because I think everybody should have a label, but because I think everybody should always learn how their brain works so that they're not working against it, they're working with it, and so that they feel like, aha, I get who I am, right?
Mhm.
And that diagnosis, I mean, from a really practical standpoint, the diagnosis is part of how you access those services. And I think that's important to know as well, right? Because you can go and disclose, this is what I know about myself. But unfortunately, the system that we work in, you need to have that documentation to request the accommodation. So I think the diagnosis is an important piece. I think how you deal with that diagnosis and how you talk about it is a very personal kind of thing. I know a lot of students who are like, I want to go into college fresh and I don't want to talk about this and I don't want anybody to know. And those are the students who I think have a really much more difficult time getting into things because after the fact, once they have a hard time, it's like they have to sort of backtrack and say, actually, here's something you need to know about me, right?
Yeah, we've
Yeah.
had guests on the podcast who spoke of that
Yeah.
experience. So,
Yeah.
if you're curious to hear how that's worked out for some other students, I recommend going back and listening. Maybe to last year's episode with a UCLA student who
Yes.
tried to go in without disclosing and had some hiccups. It's an understandable impulse, though, and I'm
Of
not going to
course.
say that it's never worked for anybody.
Oh, no, and it does. It works for some people, right? I think that's a really good point. I'm glad you said that. Like, it does work for some people, and I think that there's a push-pull sometimes with parents and children, and, I say children, but they're actually young adults, and I think that's really important because as you're growing into your own, you know, being seen more in that young adult space as opposed to I'm a child is an important part of that. There's sort of a push-pull because some parents don't want students to disclose because they're worried about how it might affect their future. And some parents really want students to disclose because they're worried about how their future will go if they don't have the supports they need. So it's an interesting process. And I know I've heard the conversations on the podcast, and I think that there are pros and cons in all of those directions. My own 22-year-old who is now out of college, um, chose to disclose in his college essay. And I mean, he's just very loudly and proudly autistic, which is
Mhm.
fantastic. I'm very happy for him. He chose to disclose in his college essay, and I wasn't sure what to think about that. I wasn't sure whether it was, but it was his choice, and he made that choice. So I think that disclosing is something that you can do as you feel comfortable, and I think the thing that's really important to know is you don't have to disclose to everybody, and that's the thing that I think we kind of miss sometimes is you can start rolling out disclosure one person at a time, right? You can start having those conversations with people who you trust and feel comfortable with, or who all of a sudden, like that moment where you sort of recognize the and you're like, oh, this is somebody who I think will completely understand this because they're a lot like me. And I think that disclosure over time helps. One of the things I think is really important is for parents to have conversations early with students about how do you have those conversations? How do you talk about who you are? How do you disclose? What does it mean to disclose? Does it mean you tell somebody everything about yourself, or does it mean you explain sort of this is what I need? What does that look like for each individual? What is disclosure is an important conversation to have.
Yeah. And speaking of parents and the really important role that they have in guiding young adults, what should parents know about the supports that are available? Like, what should they expect as they're coaching their young adult to, or maybe a younger child even, to disclose and to access supports and services, like from school or from regional center even?
Sure, and I think the first thing is that question of, like, how young do you start having those conversations? I
Yeah.
would advocate you start having them in middle school, if not younger. I really do. I think the more we prepare our children to understand who they are, the more we can help them let go of the other labels that they're holding onto themselves, right? Like, we don't want kids to think, "I'm lazy, I'm unmotivated, I'm not trying hard enough." We want them to think like, "Oh, here's what's gonna work for me. This is my brain takes in information in a different way. You know, I need the lights down, or I need some quiet space," or whatever it is that they need to be comfortable, right? So I think starting to have those conversations young is important. I think setting students up to start having those conversations on their own, whether that means coaching on the sidelines and having, like, scripts that you practice at home that you can then try at school. I would say if you're doing it with a younger child, it's really important to also have the conversation with the teachers so that they know how to receive that advocacy. We don't wanna set kids up to fail, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
we do have research from autistic people on self-advocacy
Yeah.
that says the barrier isn't that we don't know how to self-advocate,
Nope.
it's that people don't know how to receive our needs and do
100%.
not honor the things we advocate for. So parents really should be aware that teaching your child to advocate is also teaching the world how to listen to your child.
Absolutely. And I think one of the important pieces that I've learned over time coaching both parents and students is to be able to have them learn how to say in some way or another, "Why you don't have to understand this, but you have to believe me." Right? And I think that's so important because I think understanding lags behind but the belief in somebody's needs is really important. And I think to some degree, it's okay to say you don't have to understand what you have to believe, because this is hard for me. It's hard for me to have this conversation. I wouldn't do it if I didn't need to. As students get to high school, they're required not only by federal law, to be invited to their IEP meetings by the time they're, in some states it's 14 and in some states it's
Yes.
15. But there's also like a transition component. There's a transition planning thing. So that support is something that parents should expect to see at 16.
Mm-hmm.
At 16 is
Yes.
transition planning. And I think it's super important for parents to know if that transition planning is not part of your child's education or IEP by 16, you need to speak up and you ask that question.
Yes. And I want to be very clear as a special educator that every child who is on an IEP has a right to that under IDEA. So parents
Absolutely.
and students be very aware that centering the young adult and having transition planning is essential.
Absolutely, and we're on the same page there. As a former special educator myself, and a special education advocate, that is like 100%. I absolutely agree. And I think it's important for the young adult to have a say in that transition process. I firmly believe we should not be talking about students. We should be talking with students, right? They should have a say in what that transition planning looks like. They should have a say in what their future looks like. And sometimes it's not going to be the same as what their parents expect it to be. And those are tough conversations, but the support is still important, right? It's important to know it's there. It's also important to know that there are various names for support systems in colleges and on community colleges and in apprenticeships, right? Sometimes it's disability services, sometimes it's access services, sometimes it's student support. So knowing the different names so you can ask about that as you start thinking about what's next in your future. Is it a job coach that you're looking for? Is it a student support system that you're looking for? But also to know there are no IEPs in college, and
No.
that's important to know too, right?
Yeah.
The accommodations and supports that come in colleges are very different and than they are in high school. So being prepared for the fact that it's not going to be the same kind of services and support, and that there's going to need to be documentation. So, you know, this is very nitty-gritty, but I think it's important too, is that in an IEP process, there's a triennial component of things, which
Mhm.
means every 3 years, there's an opportunity for a student to be reevaluated. The IEP team can decide not to do that if they think there's enough information. If your student is in high school and their triennial comes up, do not waive that right, because they will need that evaluation information when they go to college and bring it to the Disability Services Center.
Yes. And particularly if there are assessment results and concrete data points that the Disability Services Office can use, that's very helpful because they're looking for clear documentation. And while the IEP process looks at educational eligibility and not a medical diagnosis, a lot of those psychological measurement tools are still really helpful.
Yeah. So I'm always encouraging people to say, I know that parents and students alike worry that it means that they may not be eligible for services anymore, which to some degree could be a celebration, right?
Yeah.
Right? But also, I think it's important to know that, like, you don't want your child, on top of going to college, to have to pursue testing to prove that they need support if they have the opportunity to do it before they're there. The other thing is to know that when your child's 18, they have to do this on their own. And I think this is a common knowledge piece that I just want to reiterate, right? So
Mhm.
preparing for the fact that you may have to start, scaffolding to back away a little bit as a parent is really important to know too, because it's hard. And I speak as a parent when I say that.
Mhm.
It is hard to let go. For some parents, it's hard to let go because you may have spent your entire student's lifetime of K through 12 being the person who really advocates for them, but you have to pass the torch at some point. Um, And it's okay. It's okay to do that.
Yeah, and it is emotionally fraught. I think preparing yourself and your child for the fact that there will be times when you make a mistake navigating the system, and there will be times when you do every single thing right and the system will not have a good response regardless. Like, those things are challenging. So what do you advise parents and students to do to prepare for those lumps and bumps?
Oh my goodness, that's a tough question, right? Because there are always going to be lumps and bumps, right? I live in Maine. I call them the potholes. We bump into them and we come back out again. So, your journey is always going to have potholes. We really hope systems will support students, but systems are systems, right? They're not built specifically to look at individual students. They're built to look at the success of the system as a whole, right? So that's one thing I advise both parents and young adults is to recognize that the system is set up in a specific kind of way. Let's talk about how that system is set up, and let's talk about where you might get stuck. And so, what's the workaround for that, right? Is it, okay, I have to figure out what it is that I say to make sure that my needs are heard? And if they're not heard, what's my next step kind of thing? Or is it maybe this isn't the right system for me to be entering into? And I think that's an important conversation to have as well, right? Because maybe a 4-year college isn't the right system at this time. Maybe it's a community college. Maybe it's not even college. Maybe it's, an apprenticeship. Maybe it's so looking at the different systems and saying, like, which is the system that I feel like I can be most successful in is a really important piece of that as well. And sometimes it's a matter of having really tough conversations where you say, you're going to try and you're going to try and you're going to try and you might fall down. And as a parent, my job is to make sure I'm here if you fall down to help you bounce back as much as I can, right?
Absolutely. And I also think that imagining how success could feel is really powerful in terms of overcoming some performance anxiety that at least for me, giving myself permission to imagine that I could do well is
Yeah.
very important.
And I think our young adults surprise us because I think as parents, we don't always imagine their a future the same way our students do. And so when they tell us what success looks like, we're like, I never even thought of that. That's amazing. Or we're like, oh, I never even thought of that. I'm not sure what I think of that. Right. So those conversations are important too.
Yeah. I mean, most of the time when I come up with something when I'm confronted with something I've never thought about before, my reaction is like silent terror. So just like letting the first reaction marinate a little bit. Speaking of those varied pathways and the like guidance and discernment of figuring out what is going to work for you, are there strategies that you've seen work for kids and families, or things that have kind of backfired and not worked so well?
Um, yes, and to both, I think is the answer to that. The first strategy that I think works really well is like motivational interviewing, right? Which
Mhm.
is the process of sitting down with a young adult and just talking to them about what are their interests, what do they like, what do they do well, what would they like to try, those kinds of things. When I work with parents and kids, I often will do it separate. I do it separately, right? So I
Mhm.
have, I work with kids, and I'm really invested in letting them know that I'm there for them. I'm their advocate. I'm there to have conversations with them. That it's not always going to get like dictated back to their parents. So it's a safer space. I want to make sure that they understand that like I'm there to work out things with them. When I have conversations with parents, I'm there to work out things with them too,
Mhm.
right? To talk through. And so, like, motivational interviewing is something you can do with both parents and students. Like, but the conversation with parents is different. It's kind of like, what do you envision for your child? What do you envision for
Yeah.
them? What are your expectations? And then I will often have a time where I'll bring them together into the room together and say, okay, this is what I've heard from you, and this is what I've heard from you, and try and like facilitate a conversation about where there are similarities and where there are differences. Um, and sometimes it's tougher, right? Sometimes it's tougher because the expectations completely don't align. And sometimes that's about a parent's expectations are very different than a student's, either because they're lower or they're higher. And I think that's important to note, right? What
Mhm.
what they expect of or think that their student is going to be able to do may be very different than what the child is or young adult thinks that they're going to be able to do. And those can be really fraught. Those can be really difficult conversations. But the one thing that I think is really poignant in those kinds of situations is to be able to say, look at how amazing it is that your child has an idea of who they want to be. And sometimes that's the thing that parents have to marinate in, is this like, they're a fully fledged person on their own. I've done my job well in helping them become a fully fledged person with their own ideas, right? And sometimes it's not that easy.
Mhm.
Sometimes it becomes really tricky, and I think that's the place where people get caught, is the letting go of what they expect and being able to accept that it's not going to go down a path that they thought it was, and letting their child try different things. Um, so, I think the first thing that has worked well is to be able to have those conversations separately and then together. The second thing that has works well is to be able to celebrate the child that you have like helped create this personality, and that they have taken it and become their own person. And one thing that has been most extraordinary, and for me too, and I actually talk about this when I talked with the person who wrote the report, I talked about the ability to sort of let go of my need to sort of navigate all of the systems for my own child, right? And I have 3 children, 28, 22, and 14. So I've navigated the systems in various ways. They're all neurodivergent, right? Um, and to be able to let go and pass some of that on has allowed me to step back and just be a parent who develops a relationship with my child based on our shared interests, our mutual dislikes, our mutual ability to make puns, whatever it is, right?
Mhm.
This this experience is no longer based around their disability. It's based around who we are as people. And when I see that happen, it's really such a mutual relief. It's such a mutual relief to be able to say, like, we are forming a relationship based on who we are as humans instead of based on what we're fighting against as people.
Mhm.
And that's just so rewarding to see and so hard to do at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And parenting is often very isolating. We parents don't get a ton of systemic support here these days. So,
Nope.
parents, if you're listening to this and being like, oh my God, I don't have the bandwidth to be that good all the time, felt, yes. So speaking of that, like what kinds of support are most helpful for the young adult looking past high school? Like what's
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the first thing I would say is the first support is, um, you know, I think in schools right now, like K through 12 schools, public schools in particular, finding somebody who can be a support in terms of mentoring you in thinking through what your future looks like, whether it's a teacher or whether it's a career counselor or whether it's a guidance counselor. I think that support's really important. I think having peer-to-peer mentors is also important. So, like somebody who's a little bit older than you, who may be further along on the journey, whether it's a sibling or whether it's somebody when you were a freshman in high school, they were a senior in high school and they're that much further along, is really
Mhm.
important too.
Yeah.
Um, I like to say a peer group, but there's not always a peer group. And that's really that's tough.
Yeah. Some
That's,
schools have a team or a hobby that
yeah,
clusters a lot of
yeah,
like-minded neurodivergent kids, whether it might be, the fencing team or debate
yeah,
or Model UN or theater.
yeah,
But some students don't find that
yeah.
comfortable peer group home in high school, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think so. So I think identifying what you like to do and what you're comfortable with is important for students, right? Because we don't want to push, let me rephrase that. I don't think we should push students to be people who they aren't, right? And that's like authenticity is so,
Mhm.
so, so important to let them be who they are. So finding that space isn't a matter of saying like you have to try a sport, you have to try an art, you have to try it's a matter of like letting them sort of figure that out on their own. But I also think like it's hard because thinking through what those supports could be are so individualized for each person, you know. I have this wonderful young adult that I work with right now, and we've had such great conversations about the difference between being alone and being lonely. And that's a conversation that we've had both together and with
Mm-hmm.
parents, because a lot of parents see students spending time by themselves and they think they're lonely.
No, people project loneliness onto
Yeah,
autistics who are, in fact, experiencing the greatest contentment they've had all week.
I like being alone. I actually am, you know, I'm very good at being social, and then I have no social battery left.
There's a real distinction between empowering somebody to know what the neuronormative social expectation is and forcing conformity to that
Yeah.
expectation.
Yeah.
Letting somebody to choose whether to camouflage in certain situations could potentially even empower them.
Absolutely. And well, and explaining that to them, right? Explaining to them that, and I think that goes back to the idea of disclosure, right? And I think that's probably I'm glad that you said that, because it goes back to the idea of disclosure is camouflaging and masking when they are necessary can be very overwhelming. But you can choose, and that choice is like that autonomy is just such an important piece of really helping young adults figure out who they want to be in their next iteration of life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So when should parents like start working on those conversations and that stepping back and kind of letting the young person lead? What is the age at which you want to start letting them take the reins, or is it really variable?
I think it's really variable, right? You have to look at the developmental appropriacy of that, and remember that your autistic child is going to have varying skills in varying ways, right? So they might be ready to do all of their laundry and all of that kind of stuff, but not ready to take on social situations without your support, or vice versa, right?
Mhm.
They may not be ready to do some of those functional skills, but they might be ready to do some of the social situations. I do think the younger the better, to be really honest about it. I think, and it doesn't have to be everything all at once. You know, I'm a big proponent of the what's known as the I do, you do, I do, we do, you do,
Yes.
right? And that's
Gradual release of control.
exactly. It's exactly. And it can be like, I show you how to do this for a month and a half, or I show you how to do this for a year.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be the same timetable. And then it's like, as long as it takes us to do it together is
Mhm.
fine. And then you try it. And if it doesn't work, we step back and we try a different way. But I do think the earlier the better, because then you're introducing sort of those skills and not all of a sudden saying we have 1 year. We have one
Yeah.
year to get all of this done, because that's overwhelming for everybody, right?
Mhm.
And it's not practical.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I wrote a book called Adulting Made Easy, and I didn't realize how much adulting was not easy for me until I started writing this book, and was, telling stories of like what I was like in my 20s, because I didn't actually know how to do it well. And realize like there are things that we don't even think about that we need to teach our kids. Like, what do you need in a first aid kit, right? Like,
What is in your vehicle emergency kit? Like, okay,
100%.
one, driving and driving from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction is a
Mhm.
huge issue.
Right, and so if you start, like, those little things early, right? And I think a lot of us as parents, sometimes we do it because it's easier to do it. So, like, those kinds of things are important to start teaching, like, really practical skills. Like, I remember when my oldest started
Mhm.
thinking about college, she didn't realize that you needed to bring your own linens and towels and things like that. And I realized, oops, I probably should have mentioned that to her. Yeah. So, I mean, I think as soon as you can start having those conversations and do them in little doses, like that's the piece that I think is important. Like, you don't want to overwhelm your child with doing it all at once, right? Like, that's an info dump. That's an info dump of like, here's all the things that I know you need to do by the time you turn 18. That's a sure way to have somebody say, "I don't wanna turn 18."
Yeah.
And take your cues from the person you're talking to, your young adult. Car conversations are great. If you have the opportunity to have a car conversation when you're not looking at each other and you're just talking,
Yeah.
those 5-minute conversations are fantastic. They can, and leaving it open to say like, come back and let me know if you have questions. This conversation can keep going. That's totally fine. And also I think the last thing I would say is being comfortable with having to let go is the hardest thing. That's so hard is to know at some point you have to take a deep breath and say, I've done the things that I know I need to do to help prepare my child, and I need to trust that they're going to try it. They're going to do it as well as they can, and they know they can come back to me if they have questions.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of like letting your child try it, how do you coach parents around accepting when the thing the child tries isn't what the parent expects? The child tries community college and lives at home, and the parent always expected that their young adult would go to a 4-year residential school.
Yeah, I think that's a tough thing, right? What I do coach parents around is trying to let go of there being a typical or a normal, right? And I think that's particularly hard, but that's the point that I really try to have a conversation around is like, this isn't about the expectations of society. This isn't about what your niece or nephew is doing. This isn't about what your neighbor's child is doing. This is about what your child needs and what your child is going to do. And the fact that it may take a different timeline or a different look doesn't mean they're not going to have a successful life, right? And to remind parents, and it's not necessarily reminding them as much as having conversations about like, what's your end goal? What is your end goal for your child? And most parents will say, I want them to be happy and I want them to have a productive life, right? And oftentimes what I will say is define happy, right? Because happy doesn't mean cheerful, right? So what I want them to be able to say is like, what does happy look like for my child? And what does productive look like, right? And so we have those kinds of conversations about what does happy and productive look like? And can it look different from what you expect it to? And is that okay, right? And the is that okay is where we keep coming back to. And I drill deep and say, why is that not okay? Or can you explain to me what you're feeling? Because a lot of times that's the feeling behind is the part is like, is it disappointment? Is it sadness? Is it fear? What is it, right? Like, what is it that's driving this need for it to be something different? And a lot of times it's comparison. And I'm not surprised by that, but I think it's important to say it out loud. A lot of times it's because parents feel the need to show other people that their child is going to be okay also. But what they need to know is okay doesn't have to look the same as the other kids around them.
Yeah. And we do live in a society that feels comfortable judging parents, particularly moms, by what their child does. And so parents feeling guilt or shame about perceived judgments from other people is grounded in a certain amount of real stigma. And so I think it's, I just have so much compassion for parents who are on the receiving end of ableist judgments from busybodies, because that's happening and it's just the bits.
Oh, absolutely. 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 And I am always just like cheering on the inside when I hear a parent say, I'm glad your kid's on the honor roll. My child made it to school every day this year. Right. And like, those are the parents I'm like, you did it. You did it. You said the hard part out loud, and I'm so proud of you for it. And there's absolutely nothing but sincerity behind that for me, because I'm proud of them for saying, success might look different.
Like, my child survived a health crisis. Their academics were not the focus for our family this year, and we're just all so glad we're still here. And I think that there is a lack of a brave, supportive space for some of those more complicated, nuanced narratives.
Yeah. And that's the space I try to be. right? Is I want, and one of the things is I do it by example. My own children, my daughter would say she's my first pancake, to be honest, right?
It's always a little wonky.
She's the first pancake, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they got
I
better
know what
over
you mean.
time. So, and I appreciate that, and I love the way she puts that. And now I have a 14-year-old who's a freshman in high school, and we had some really big conversations about it's okay if you don't take the same classes as your peers. You do what makes you feel most comfortable and happy, and know that I believe in you and I trust you to make the decisions that feel most comfortable for you. He's saying to me, I'm exhausted. There's so many people. It's too much noise. It's too much. And I'm just like, so that's your focus. Your focus is on making sure that you are psychologically okay, right? We're not going to worry about whether you're in the highest level classes or getting the highest grades. We're going to worry about whether you come home and you're okay. And okay is an amazing goal for so many of our autistic students because okay is hard. It's hard for anyone. But you add all of the extra like masking and social pressures and sensory input and all of those things, and it's an exhausting life to live sometimes. And I just want parents to know okay is an exceptional goal. You know?
Yeah. I mean, if I could be okay enough that I stayed regulated and had no more meltdowns, I think that like, wow, what a life I would be living.
You
Oh
and
my
me
goodness.
both. You and me both. And
Yeah.
I mean that sincerely. Like I
Yeah.
am, and I don't, I'm 50 years old
Mm-hmm.
and I still have that. I still
Yeah.
have meltdowns. I still have shutdowns. I still have moments. And okay is sometimes my goal too.
Yeah.
And I think if we as adults, fully fledged adults, if our goal sometimes is to be okay, then we need to be able to be cognizant of the fact that
Yeah.
that's the same goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it is between the last recording of this podcast and this current recording, like I have been in the fetal position saying, I hate being autistic, I hate having meltdowns. And so, I think it's important to talk about how it is hard, even for those of us that have gotten to the point where we can both do it and talk to others about how to follow in our footsteps. It doesn't
Yeah.
stop being challenging.
Well, and I mentioned I was at a conference this week. I don't know. I can't
Recent conference.
time and conference is totally different. But I presented and then I was walking down the hallway and I realized I was stimming. And I didn't realize how, and I'm doing it with my fingers. You can't see it
Mhm.
right now but I didn't realize how overwhelmed my system had been until I realized I'm walking down the hallway and I'm stimming. I actually don't, and that was fine. That's who I am. It's just, but I didn't realize how tough that was for me until I was like, I'm stimming and I'm going to go find my hotel room because I can't people anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
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 So, what are some supports, either as a professional attending a conference or as a college student, that can help with that, but that are like a little more obscure to ask for?
Well, I think, one of the things that is, when you think about lecture halls, for example,
Mhm.
right? I think,
Absolutely.
oh, oof,
Huge.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. Echoey, loud, bright, that kind of thing. I think one of like a support you wouldn't even think to ask for is, can we dim the lights on this side of
Yeah.
the room?
Can we
Right.
go half on, half off with the
Yeah.
fluorescence? That's
Yeah.
a great adjustment.
Yeah. I think one of the other things you can do if you are somebody who needs to be alone, one of the other obscure accommodations is to talk to residential services about what medical documentation might you need for a single, right? So that you're not in a space with lots and lots of, or you have 4 roommates or 3 roommates. That can be very stressful. So is there a way that you can have a single or be put in like a quiet dorm, finding like spaces and times where like a dining hall might be quieter is
Mhm.
important too. Or, some of the things I've seen some colleges do that are really cool is like having a social night where literally your social night is to like go into the room and do your own hobby around other people. So like advocating for that
Mhm.
would be so amazing. Like it doesn't have to be any kind of club. It can just be like, I'm going to knit, you're going to read. We're going to be around other people at the same time. And I think that's a powerful thing too.
Being
Functioning.
able to prepare your own food because you have something that affects your ability to eat, totally reasonable.
Yeah.
Just like, having an access to an elevator or a ground floor room would be for a student with a mobility disability.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, and I think just being able to have the opportunity to understand what are the processes, and that's something to be able to ask ahead of time. Like if I have a disagreement or a a misunderstanding with somebody that I am in class with somebody I live with somebody, what do I do? Right? So asking that up front can be an actual like proactive accommodation,
Yeah.
because once you're in the midst of it, if you don't know and you're overwhelmed, and there are a lot of people who autistic people, when they're overwhelmed, like they cannot communicate as clearly as they would like to. Um, and I think that's the important piece. It's not that they can't communicate, it's as much as they would like to, right? Asking about where is there a place that if I need support with executive functioning skills like planning, organization, and management, is there a study center? Is there peer tutoring available? Those kind of accommodations I think are a little less known.
Yeah.
Um,
But,
but necessary.
knowing where to turn for
Yeah.
social issues, for academic issues, before things get to that boiling point,
Yeah.
and it's hard to even problem solve, and you're worried about controlling impulses that might end up being more destructive than constructive.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think those are questions that you can ask ahead of time, and you don't necessarily need to say, "Because it may become a problem." You can just say,
Yeah.
"Because this is something I wanna know. I wanna understand about this campus," right? Or I wanna understand about this job. Well, and I think the last thing I would say too is having a plan with your trusted adults, right? It
Mhm.
might be your parents, it may be somebody else, and I think that's important to know. You have to know who your trusted adults are in your life, and for some people, it may not be their parents, and that's
Yeah,
okay, right?
that's totally
Yeah.
understandable, fine.
But having a plan as to, like, here's when you should worry, right? And I that's kind of a funny way to say it, but, like, what's your worry plan, right? So, for example, with my son, not a texter, didn't like to call.
Mhm,
He does now as he's older, but we had a plan where it's like, if I texted him to check in, all he had to do was send me an emoji. That was it.
mhm,
Like, just so I knew he was okay or not okay, right? And I think having those kinds of plans of, like, when do you get support and how do you get support is important to know too. Like, how can you reach out when you're having trouble figuring out how to reach out? And having a plan for that matters a lot. And if it's sending a thumbs down emoji to somebody who knows that that means you need help
mhm,
in some way, that's your plan. Or if it's, we're going to check in every couple of days. And as parents, to be able to, or trusted adults, whoever you are, is to be able to say, like, when I text you, if you don't want to talk, that's totally fine. I just need to know you're okay. Um,
mhm.
how do we do that? Or, when do you want me to get involved? Those kinds of things I think are super important too.
Yeah, yeah.
And I want to be really clear in saying that probably will, I don't know. I was gonna say that probably will never happen. That's not true. It may not always happen. So, like, planning for it doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Planning
Planning
for it.
for it can prevent it from happening.
Yeah. Yeah, because then you're not obsessively worrying about what if it happens and I don't know what to do, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Frees up the mental energy for productive growth.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the last thing on this that I'd like to say is we spend so much time as a society saying to kids who struggle throughout high school or elementary school, saying, like, "Don't worry about it. Once you get to college, you'll be fine. Everything's gonna," and I'm like, "We need to stop saying that because we don't know that. We don't know that they're
Mhm,
gonna flourish and blossom and all those things." So being careful not to set people up for the expectation that everything's gonna change and they're gonna be totally different and the world's gonna be different and people are gonna see them differently once they get to college. I would like to say, like, let's just stop doing that. Let's stop
yeah.
saying that to people. Let's be more realistic in saying there's different opportunity here.
Yeah, I haven't heard high school's the best 4 years of your life in a while. It was certainly not the best 4 years of mine. So if the next thing we say to kids can be, "Everything's gonna be," like, stop saying to kids is, "Everything's gonna be great in college," I would like that because
Me
the
too.
reset fantasy, it's a seductive fantasy, but it's not reality.
No.
College is a contrived environment, but you're still yourself, and there are still
Yeah.
normal other people there
Yep.
from
Yeah.
all walks of life and experience.
Yep. So I think that's my, I don't know if it's my words of wisdom, but it's my words of wish, right? My words of wish are, I wish that we would stop saying, college is going to be great, or whatever happens after high school is going to be when you start fitting in, because meh, I don't,
Yeah,
ugh.
I mean, the thing with people who are 19 is that they were just 18 and in high school. They don't like magically become accepting because they graduate. It's a process. And yes, as an autistic adult, I have a lot more flexibility in terms of self-accommodating, but I also have an overwhelming amount of responsibility in order
Right?
to maintain that independence.
Absolutely. And that's important for people to prepare young adults for too, is that becoming an adult is tough. Becoming an autistic adult when you were an autistic young adult may be tougher, because that
Independence
responsibility
and
is hard.
responsibility is incredibly hard for any teenager, but it's extra hard when you've got a disability
Yeah.
cooking in the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And the nice thing is there are people like you out there who are honest and open about that and willing to talk about what's hard and also how you're handling it. And I love that. I love that for all of the all of the students with autism who are going to college. I love that they have a Catherine who they can listen to and realize they're not alone in this process. I really do.
Thank you.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
I try. You try too. Keep
We
up the
do.
good work.
And you as well. Thank you.
All right. And I think that's our show. Thank you for all the great advice. It was so good to talk to you,
You too.
Amanda.
Yeah.
Hopefully, this will be a great listen for
Yeah.
students and parents.